Hey, Why Religion friends, Professor Anthony Sweat here. Welcome to another fabulous episode of Why Religion. A little question to start. Have you ever had a debate with someone over the meaning of a word? Maybe you debated with a friend how quandary is different than dilemma, for example, or how the word loathe has a different meaning than hate, or maybe like in the movie Princess Bride, how unbelievable is different than inconceivable.
He didn't fall? Inconceivable.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Sometimes the debates get so intense we may even turn to a third party to try settle it, maybe a parent or a friend, or most likely today, Google. Well, one of the greatest debates in the entire Western world took place in the 16th century between William Tyndale and Sir Thomas More over the definition of words. The debate was so intense that it spanned 5 years and resulted in producing 3 books. That's a big debate. Well, what was it all about? William Tyndale was a Protestant reformer, and he was producing a radical translation of the New Testament into common English from the Greek. Thomas More was a Catholic, and for many good reasons opposed Tyndale's translation work, fearing that it was biased against the church. More remarked about Tyndale's work that, quote, "Whoso calleth the New Testament calleth it by a wrong name, except they call it Tyndale's Testament," end of quote. Both men knew that a lot was at stake, literally their lives on the stake, because they both understood how words change the way that people understand doctrine. To say it another way, there are theological implications to translation. Words really matter. Tyndale's translation would win the day, of course, laying the foundation for the rendering of most of the English Bibles that followed, including the King James Version of the Bible. But was Tyndale's interpretation exactly right? If only we had another book that employed King James vernacular in its translation to help settle the debate. Oh wait, we do. Dr. Jan Martin from BYU's Department of Ancient Scripture has recently published a groundbreaking article on how the Book of Mormon's English translation speaks to and deftly addresses some of these theological debates over the meaning of words.
The Book of Mormon's job is to stabilize and help us interpret the Bible correctly. And as anyone knows who does any translation, theological concepts are connected tightly to the language that's used. This study that I do shows that the Book of Mormon, even though it was translated in the 19th century, speaks to 16th century theological issues, and it does it incredibly well.
Hundreds of years ago, if only Sir Thomas More and William Tyndale knew that over in the Americas, buried in a hill in upstate New York, the Lord had prepared a third party to settle some of their debates. On today's episode, get ready to enter the fray and see how the Book of Mormon does this. This is Why Religion.
Each year, religion professors at Brigham Young University produce hundreds of publications on subjects related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This podcast brings this research into one place to enlighten the everyday seeker of truth.
Seek learning, even by study and also by faith.
Interviewing the author, we discuss why this study was done, why it matters, and why the professor chooses to be both a scholar and a disciple. This is Why Religion. Research to enlighten your mind.
Recently, Professor Brad Wilcox sat down with his colleague, Professor Jan Martin, to discuss her publication on the theological value of the King James language in the Book of Mormon. In part 1, Dr. Martin will give us some background on the King James translation and some additional insight into the Tyndale and Thomas More debates. Specifically, she will examine 3 of their translating theological issues and how the Book of Mormon uses King James language to address them. Dr. Martin will look specifically at the words priest versus elder, love versus charity, and congregation versus church. In part 2, they will move a little bit more toward application as usual, discussing how the Book of Mormon and its language speaks to all people in all times, and why the archaic yet heightened language of the King James Version is helpful for personal revelation. And in part 3, Sister Martin will tell us a little bit about her unique academic and professional journey that brought her to BYU's religion department, and she'll share some wonderful insights about her own personal faith. So here is Professor Brad Wilcox and Professor Jan Martin.
Now, one of the articles that you've published is the theological value of the King James language in the Book of Mormon. As we look at the translation process, there's always a debate as to whether Joseph Smith was reading King James English off of his instruments that he used, or whether he was using King James English because he was familiar with it and trying to put it into English. But you know what? That debate really has very little to do with the direction you've gone.
That's right.
And that's why I find your research so invigorating, because you say here that the Book of Mormon indeed asserts a substantial reason for the 17th century prose, that we find the justification right in the Book of Mormon, and I'd never considered that before.
Yeah, I mean, and I love 1 Nephi 13. I mentioned it in the article that the book itself declares the purpose of it, and one of those purposes is to establish biblical truths. And, as we know, the Bible all by itself can be interpreted hundreds of ways. And so we need a second, third, fourth, fifth witnesses to help us pinpoint exactly theologically what the Lord is wanting us to believe. And so the Book of Mormon's job is to stabilize and help us interpret the Bible correctly. And as anyone knows who does any translation, theological concepts are connected tightly to the language that's used. And, this is what a debate about all translators use, is which word should I put here? What is the best representation of the original? And usually there's several choices when you're translating. You don't have to translate something one way. There's usually several ways to say something. And so translation is an art and a science, and it's tough, and it never satisfies everybody. And so, here we are into this beautiful world of controversy. But the Book of Mormon actively engages with the KJV's theology, and that's what most people aren't aware of.
Now, you say that there's some examples in the Book of Mormon of words that are used that then validate, substantiate, they clarify and the word choice in the Bible.
That's right.
Tell us about some of those examples.
Well, the purpose of the article is one of the things I wanted to do, as we talked about already, is make the Bible and the Book of Mormon language connection relevant to a modern reader. But in order to make it relevant, you need to know the whole history of Bible translation. You can't just take the Bible as a modern thing. And one of the things that I study is how we got the language that we got and where did it start. And Bible translation started in the 1500s from the Greek source text and the Hebrew source text. And so to understand the way our Bible is, you have to actually go back and look at our earliest translators and what they were doing and dealing with. How do you take Greek and put it into English? How do you take Hebrew and put it into English and have it make sense without getting that word for word problem? Because the minute you try to go word for word, it doesn't make sense in the...
Then it drives us crazy.
It's not English now. It's a Greekified version of English or a Latinized version of English, and that doesn't feel right to us. It needs to feel like English. So I study William Tyndale, and he's the first person who ever attempted to take the Greek or the Hebrew and put it into English.
So what was John Wycliffe's contribution? Because I thought he was before William Tyndale.
And he was in the 1400s, but John Wycliffe was using the Latin Vulgate.
Oh, so he was going from Latin to English.
Yes, and the Latin Vulgate itself is a translation. So he's taking a translation of a translation and putting it into English. And what William Tyndale did that was so unique is he skipped the Latin Vulgate and went straight back to the Greek, which is the original language of the New Testament. So he's skipping out that Septuagint into Latin thing. He's just going straight back to a Greek manuscripts that he had access to and putting it straight into English without the Latin detour.
So he was able to get around
Yes.
that. But as you think about it, there were others who also could understand the Greek. And I'm sure, as you said earlier, there were some controversies there as
Yes.
far as which choice you're
choice.
making.
Yes. And so there were other, Greek was something that it started being taught in England in the late 1400s, about 1490s at Oxford. And so William Tyndale's really on the cusp of even being able to understand Greek and even put it into English. So at the time, Greek was a new science, if you want to call it that. So, William Tyndale's really on the cusp of taking Greek and really making it an English translation. And so he's really putting a lot into the way we have our Bibles today. He is known as the father of the English Bible for this reason, because he was the first person to really try and massage Greek and put it into a developing English language.
Well, what about Sir Thomas More? Did he have a knowledge of Greek?
Oh, yes. And he was one of the early Greek scholars in England, and he was very good with Greek. But he was a very staunch Catholic, and Catholics were very reluctant to put the Bible into English. They really admired the Latin translation, the Vulgate, and they really wanted to leave it there. It's not till the 1580s that the Catholic Church actually puts out an English translation of the Bible. So almost 100 years after William Tyndale's working with this, the Catholics kind of finally come around and say, okay, let's try an English translation. So Thomas More was not opposed to an English translation, but he was reluctant to go there because of the problems that are attached to when you translate what happens to the theology.
Is that why he was so critical?
Yes. Yes, he was. And he jumps all over Tyndale for a lot of reasons.
You mean scholars disagree?
Oh, yes.
You
all
mean
the time.
scholars sometimes
Even back then, And interestingly, he engages in a public debate. He didn't just have personal opinions against Tyndale. He writes a public refutation of Tyndale's translation and just takes him to task for a lot of little word choices. So in my article, I just pick 3 of those word choices to talk about. There were more. Tyndale really got raked over the coals by More, but I pick 3 of the big theological ones that More was particularly upset about, and that is the priest versus elder, the love versus charity, and the congregation versus church. And so those are really weighty theological terms, and More just jumps down his throat pretty much.
Well, it wasn't until I learned Spanish that I understood that there was a difference between what we would call elder and presbytero, or presbyter.
Yeah.
Presbyterian church.
Yes.
I mean, suddenly when I learned Spanish, I went, the light just went on.
I get it. I can see now there's a theological issue here, not just a preference of words. And that's exactly why More doesn't like what Tyndale's doing. He thinks Tyndale's purposely choosing words to sell a Protestant interpretation, and that everyone who reads this Bible is suddenly going to think certain things and then not become Catholic and not want to be Catholic because of the theology attached to the words he's using.
We see something earlier, much earlier, when Athanasius is gathering what we have today as the New Testament.
That's right.
And some people today say, he just picked things that were promoting his point
agenda.
of view.
Yep. And so, scholars are always accusing each other of that. You see things in a particular way, and that's why you're making these conclusions. And, I don't know that we're ever going to get rid of that.
So elder, priest, what's the big deal? I mean, for the Catholics, they wanted the word priest.
Yes.
The Protestants wanted the word elder.
That's right.
And you could fight back and forth.
Yes.
But how does the Book of Mormon start to inform that?
Well, and that's what's so fun about it is, for me, the Book of Mormon is a book that speaks to all English speakers throughout all time. And that's what I'm trying to show here is that the 17th century language isn't just about Joseph Smith and about that translation, that there's actually a way to see what the Book of Mormon's saying that would speak to William Tyndale, and to Thomas More. And one of the interesting things for me is that the Book of Mormon cannot just be a 19th century text. If it only talks to people in the 19th century, then it can't spiritually meet the needs of anyone today or anyone in between or anyone earlier than that. And I believe that God is interested in answering everybody's questions, no matter when you lived. And so this study that I do shows that the Book of Mormon, even though it was translated in the 19th century, speaks to 16th century theological issues, and it does it incredibly well.
Now, before we dive into actually how many times it's mentioned, one word or the other in the Book of Mormon, which is interesting.
Yeah, it is.
But before we dive into that, I think it's really noteworthy that you mentioned that Joseph Smith made no changes.
No.
When he did the Joseph Smith translation
Nope.
of the King James Bible,
right.
he made no changes. He left priest, and elder. So for him, it wasn't a personal issue
No.
or a personal
No, and
quandary.
I think this is one of the evidences that Joseph was being inspired, because he's not a theologian and he's not a linguist. You know, he's a farm boy with a third grade education. So he doesn't have, I don't believe he has any idea about any of these theological controversies.
He didn't approach the Book of Mormon with an agenda.
No. And I don't think he approached his Bible translation either. You know, the KJV is not strictly a translation because he's working with an English text. He's not going back to the Hebrew or the Greek. He's learning some of those languages, but he doesn't do that in when he works with the KJV. So it's interesting that we call it a translation. It's not really. It's kind of more of an inspired review, I guess is what you would call it.
A commentary.
Yeah, a commentary. But the fascinating thing is that because he's not looking at the original languages, he doesn't twig that there might be an issue with presbyteros, what it should be, or with, agape or something. He just goes with whatever the Spirit's working with him on. But the Book of Mormon, without Joseph being aware of it, is very aware of these issues. And that, to me, is a very clear testimony that someone is inspiring Joseph, because Joseph is not aware of any of these issues.
So you point out that the word priest appears 105 times throughout the Book of Mormon, while the word elder only appears 18 times.
Yeah.
So what does that say theologically?
Well, the interesting thing about this discussion is that you have to approach the Book of Mormon's use of these words with the law of Moses being in play and then without it being in play, because we have both time periods. We have the Old Testament in the Book of Mormon at the beginning. Then we have the Christ coming and kind of that New Testament feel where the law of Moses is fulfilled. So under the Old Testament law of Moses, you see that word priest really being used, but that's Old Testament, that's Hebrew, that's what the Jewish people had. They had priests, and so the Book of Mormon reflects that. But you do see elder coming in there and being used, especially towards the end, and especially at the end when Mormon and Moroni are talking about it. Elder has a superior function, and they're ordaining priests, and so you get that New Testament feel that something else is happening. And so
in our modern church today, we see that very clearly. Yes. The elder is an office in the Melchizedek priesthood. Priest is an office in the Aaronic priesthood.
Yes. Yeah, and so the Old Testament was officiated over by the Aaronic priesthood, and so you have priests doing all those things. But when Jesus comes and brings back the Melchizedek priesthood, suddenly you have a different structure in the church, and you have this opening for having Melchizedek priesthood offices. And the Book of Mormon shows both of those. But the point that I'm trying to make in the article is that the issues surrounding these words, the theological issues, the Book of Mormon commentates on every one of them.
Wow.
And I point them all out as we go through here, that William Tyndale had an issue with ordinations. He didn't believe the New Testament's very clear about ordinations, so he wanted to reject the body of priesthood holders who are consecrated and set apart as priests. He just didn't think that was New Testament. And Thomas More is like, well, presbyteros has an authoritative meaning, and so there should be this body of ordained priests. And so that's the debate. But the Book of Mormon just really clears that up. Says, yes, ordinations are necessary. Yes, there needs to be a setting apart. Authority is passed clearly. You can't just take it upon yourself.
Which is a very Protestant idea.
Yes, which is a very Protestant idea. And the Protestants kind of had this priesthood of all believers kind of idea that everybody could just have God's authority if they were studying the Bible.
Yeah,
and
authority traced to the Bible.
And that doesn't work. And the Book of Mormon is very clear that there is a line of authority. It is passed, and it's using those terms. However, the Catholic Church was criticized for having priests who were not living the way that they were supposed to be living. And Tyndale had a huge issue with that. How can you have this ordained group of people who you then blind eye ignore, who are violating all of their covenants and ripping people off and not living the way that they should? And the Book of Mormon is very clear about priests and the way that we work with church discipline and how we don't just allow priests to get away with whatever they want. And so it's a really beautiful thing to watch the Book of Mormon commentate on both sides of these issues and resolve issues that a 19th century person doesn't know the history of.
Yeah, I think there's a connection between authority in the priesthood and power in the priesthood, and that comes through in the Book of Mormon.
That's right, it does.
Tell us about congregation versus church. That's another one where the words caused a lot of misunderstanding.
Back in the 16th century, again, the Protestants were attacking the Catholic structure and organization. They felt that it had become corrupt, that it was not based on the scriptures anymore. And so when they look at the Greek, the Greek word ecclesia doesn't really have a religious connotation. The original understanding of Greek is just an assembly of people. And it could be religious, it could be not. And so when the Protestants look at that, they say, we want these organizations that we have to be congregational, not a big bureaucratic church structured hierarchy of popes and bishops and things. They just don't see that in the New Testament because of that word ecclesia. And William Tyndale really takes the congregational idea that it's from the bottom up, that the congregations choose their leaders. They don't have them foisted on them by a bureaucracy. And so this debate, as it was going forward, was really threatening the entire structure of the Catholic Church. And the Protestants just want to toss it out, and they base it all on their understanding of ecclesia. For Thomas More and Tyndale, it's all about, do we have a church structure or don't we? And Tyndale wants a simple structure that's based locally with a local leader.
Which is very Protestant.
And then Thomas More wants the big overarching structure that's based on a leader who has priesthood keys. The Pope is supposed to be representing Peter's authority, and then you have more of a top-down governance. So there's this debate as how does the church organize? Where does the government come from? Is there this concept of a priesthood key holder who kind of directs or not? And the Book of Mormon, again, just jumps right into that, and you see congregation and church in there. And then the Book of Mormon is very clear that there is church structure, that there is a priesthood key holder, that there are things that need to happen. But again, for William Tyndale's side, that it's done in righteousness, that you can see that the church doesn't become a bureaucracy that just is upholding wickedness, that they're very conscious of their own sins and things. So it's really fascinating.
The numbers are actually eye-opening.
Yeah.
Because in the Book of Mormon, church occurs 235 times. Mm-hmm. And congregation only appears twice.
And it does that when they're quoting Isaiah mostly. Isn't that funny?
Goodness.
So when you look at the Old Testament Hebrew, they tend to translate the Hebrew words into congregation or assembly or something. And you see the congregation of Israel or the assembly of Israel a lot in the Old Testament. So in the Book of Mormon, the congregation terms really link you to the Old Testament. And church really just dominates. And so there's a real statement there by the Lord, at least, theologically, that he does have an organization, that he does have a prophet, that there are organized ways to do things, and wow.
And again, when Joseph Smith, this was before a formal church was organized in our dispensation. So Joseph Smith wasn't coming
No.
at this with an agenda.
No, I don't think that, at this point, he's just translating the Book of Mormon, and the idea of him organizing a church and being the prophet and being the first elder is not even in his brain. I'm sure that's not even come on board. And yet he's reading about all of these ways that the Lord is dealing with these previous issues that happened, long before Joseph was around. I don't believe he had any idea of the 16th century controversy. Certainly he knew about, 19th century issues, and they're still being debated all the way through the early American history. But he doesn't, I don't think, know enough about it to do this good of a job.
Well, and even if he were aware of the debate, there was such a Protestant
Yes.
environment around him that why would he come down so heavy on the Catholic
side.
point of view?
That's right. Because he's in New England, upstate New York area, and the Protestants really rule the day there. Catholics don't really have a strong presence.
I think that is an excellent example of how the Book of Mormon clarifies the Bible, which is one of its purposes.
Yeah.
Let's finish by talking about charity versus love.
Okay.
Because even today, people say, they're synonyms. But when you look at the Greek, they're not synonyms.
No, they're not. And, there was such a debate with Moore and Tyndale about should I use agape and how should I translate that into English. Agape is clearly the word in the Greek New Testament, but it could be translated several different ways. And Tyndale chooses love in its larger meaning. It's more general of a word. I can love chocolate and love my husband, but those don't mean the same thing to me. Do they?
Well, my wife would probably choose chocolate over her husband, but
and that's exactly Thomas More's issue. He just cannot understand why you would describe the love that God has for his children with the same word that you would use to say, I love my dog, or I love my cat, or my food. He wants this word to mean something different and to have a really spiritual kind of sanctified connotation. And when Tyndale comes into the New Testament and starts putting this love in there that could just mean anything, he's really offended by that because he sees the love that God has for us as something different. And so he wants that word charity that to him represents a good, godly love to stand out, and then use love when you need to. But Tyndale took charity out of the New Testament entirely. There was not one presence of charity in his translation.
Tyndale took charity out?
He did. And Moore was so mad because he's like, look, I've realized that charity as a word is only a noun. It doesn't function as a verb. So I don't say to you, Brad, I charity you. I have to say I love you. But if I want to use charity as the noun to describe the type of love, that's what the Book of Mormon does. Charity is the pure love of Christ. And that's what Moore was really mad about. He's like, how do you take the love our Savior has for us and just use love? You need to use the higher word wherever you can use it. And Tyndale didn't. He just used love everywhere. And that made Moore feel like you've just desanctified this sacrificial, incredible love that our God has for us by using this term.
And anybody who says that that's not a theological point,
it is.
That is center
Totally.
to everything.
Yes. And that's one of the beautiful things I love about the way the Book of Mormon handles it. I show the numbers in there, the way that love appears in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, it says in your article here, you
Yes.
say that there are 66 instances of the word love versus 27 instances of charity.
Right.
So it leans more toward what
Tyndale was saying.
doing.
However, it gives more his point. Because when we actually define the pure love of Christ, we use charity there. Now, sometimes in the Book of Mormon, they do just use the word love. But what's fascinating to me is that the Book of Mormon allows both of them to peacefully exist in the same scriptural text. And that's pretty much what Moore wanted, was for Tyndale to acknowledge that you didn't have to take charity out everywhere, that there were places where it probably could fit, and he just wanted Tyndale to put it back in where it would fit. And so the Book of Mormon allows that and says, you can use both terms to describe godly love, but there is something, when we look at the discussion on charity at the end of the Book of Mormon, there is just something incredibly beautiful about that word that sometimes
and that charity depends on love.
It does. It does. And so, it's just been a really fun exercise to go through theologically and look that the Book of Mormon commentates and allows both positions and kind of straightens it out instead of being an extremist. Let's either be love or let's be charity. No, there's room for both of them theologically, and the Book of Mormon illustrates that really well.
Odds are that while you're listening to this very podcast, there's some light around you somewhere. That's because light's everywhere. It gives us vision, keeps us warm, and facilitates life. Light is even responsible for developments in communications technology, the internet, and space travel. However, light is not just a physical concept. It is a central theme used throughout Scripture to literally and metaphorically describe spiritual concepts. Throughout history, scientists have studied light physically and theologians have studied light spiritually. But what if these two realms of study were combined? What if the physical light that we see is actually related to the spiritual light discussed in Scripture? Can we apply what we know about light scientifically to what we know about light doctrinally? Well, in a fascinating new book co-published by the Religious Studies Center and Deseret Book, the engineer, chemist, and Duke University professor Aaron D. Franklin explores these questions and more by connecting principles of physical light to gospel truths about spiritual light. In so doing, Dr. Franklin provides an accessible way for us all, no matter our scientific or doctrinal prowess, to learn how we see, feel, and know truth, which is, of course, light. The book is called Spiritual Physics of Light: How We See, Feel, and Know Truth. Check it out and pick it up at rsc.byu.edu. We've been listening to Dr. Jan Martin talk about her publication on the theological value of the King James language in the Book of Mormon. In part 2 of Why Religion, we like to discuss why this publication matters. How does it help us to better learn, live, and apply aspects of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ? So here's Professor Martin discussing some of these questions, specifically getting into how the Book of Mormon and its language speaks to all people in all times, and why the poetic language of the King James Version is helpful for personal revelation.
I love how here you say the existence of an underlying theology gives value to the King James English that is relevant to the modern reader.
Yeah.
And I love that. You say the Book of Mormon, from its own perspective, the 17th century language is an indispensable tool. So if the Book of Mormon were translated again into modern English, hey, Nephi said, wow, cool, dude.
Yeah.
I mean, if somebody went that far to translate it, there would be not just language lost, but theology lost.
And you would lose the whole picture of when we first try to put the Bible into English and the difficulties that took. You lose that connection, and you then make the Book of Mormon kind of a 21st century document instead of what it is, which is ability to speak to all of our Bible reading brothers and sisters from all those time periods. And, and I think about this a lot because God sees the present as a past, present, future. He sees things as one eternal now. Now, I don't know what that means always, but one thing I do understand about it is that for him, people aren't in a point of history. They're people. And they have concerns, and they have theological concerns. And Thomas More is just as important to him as I am. And Thomas More had some genuine theological concerns that he was not able to resolve by using the Bible alone. So for the Book of Mormon to come in and be of value, it can't just be of value to 19th century people. It has to be of value to anyone who has theological questions in English. And the Book of Mormon speaks to all of those centuries in a really nice way and answers all of those questions for people who may not be on the earth, but are still living in the spirit world and still have those questions. And so why wouldn't our scripture speak to them? I think it does.
Well stated. When I have students come to me and say, but it's so hard. The King James Version is so hard. The language in the Book of Mormon, thee, thou, thine, it just is so hard. I wish it weren't so hard. I always say, since when it comes to anything important, since when is easy the answer?
That's right.
We've got to be willing to dive in and recognize that the very fact that it's hard is evidence that it is valuable.
That's right. You know, and I hear that a lot. And, you know, I've had people who look at the research that I do and have just said your research is pointless because the KJV is outdated and we need there's plenty of people in the church that want the church to go away from the KJV and they want us to adopt a more modern translation. And, you know, they're entitled to those opinions and they do have some points, certain points on the Greek and some of the problems with
and
certain
we certainly
things.
Don't say that people can't read other translations.
Exactly. But I really do love what we call heightened language that allows for a bunch of interpretations and beauty and poetic understanding more than I do the flattened language of modern translations. And you know, I read them and I encourage my students to use them to help them with the KJV. But I find some of it very uninspiring because it's been flattened to the point where they've taken all of the poetry out of it and you now can't get anything out of it but then what it says. And I don't think that that's helpful for personal revelation when you flatten the language to the point where it can only mean one thing. Whereas the KJV, if you study that, allows the poetic license of people to connect with the language where they connect. And allowing that just multiplicity of feeling is really important and inspiring to me. And so I'm not anxious to get rid of the KJV, though I do understand that people need help with it. But anything worth understanding is worth working in.
In the Eastern traditions, which is what these scriptures were written in originally, symbolism and poetry is so valuable, metaphor.
Yes.
And we lose that in a Western tradition.
Yep.
And I value both the King James Version of the Bible and the Book of Mormon because it preserves that Eastern flavor, even though it's in English.
That's right. And, you know, there's so much discussion to be had over the language and what we all can get out of it that's so edifying that sometimes if we simplify it too much, we lose that. And I just think it's a tragedy to lose that. There's something incredibly valuable. That's why Isaiah is so fascinating, is he's totally in that Eastern tradition in the way that he talks and the poetic, metaphorical presentation of things. But boy, can you really get your teeth into that when you start understanding it and allowing those layers of meaning to come forth. That's what the Holy Ghost helps you with.
And that's why his writings are timeless.
Yes.
And your point is that the Book of Mormon becomes timeless because of the writing, not in spite of it, but because of the King James English within it.
Yes.
Then it speaks to all time.
And I find that really frustrating when people say it's archaic. And yeah, maybe the doth and the hath and the thine and the thy feels archaic to us because we don't use it. But that's not the main point of the language in the KJV. We need to stop focusing on those and actually look at all the rest of the words in the book. And that is where you get the deep, beautiful, metaphorical meaning that is timeless and it speaks to all people from all of these ages and not just to me, my little selfish self in the 21st century.
If you're interested in reading Professor Martin's great publication on the theological value of the King James language in the Book of Mormon, published by the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, we've included a link to it at whyreligion.byu.edu where you can go download it. And remember that if you want to connect with us at Why Religion, comment and give insights on episodes that you've been listening to, and see some great behind-the-scenes photos or get bonus material, give us a follow on Instagram at Why Religion Podcast. All right, we've arrived at our final segment of Why Religion, where we like to talk with the professor a little bit more personally about why the professor chose to be a religious educator, what led them to BYU, and why they choose faith. So we wrap up this episode with Jan Martin giving us some closing thoughts on those important questions.
Let's talk about how you got to BYU.
Okay. I began my religious education career in the church seminaries and institutes. And I taught seminary around the Utah Valley for 6 years, but found that it wasn't exactly where I wanted to be and that I preferred teaching on a deeper level and actually really liked researching. So I elected to take the leap and quit that job and move to England, where I completed a second master's degree in early modern history and then a PhD in 16th century Bible translation.
Right in England.
Yes.
So when you write about William Tyndale and you write about John Wycliffe, I mean, these are people you know well because you have been right there.
I went there and I went to their homelands and traveled around as much as I could to get to know them and their areas. And
did your love of that topic happen because you were in England, or did you go to England because of your love of that topic?
I had a hobby in reading about the Reformation before I ever went to England. And then as I was searching for something to do, a PhD in that would be interesting to BYU, I kind of looked at all the other professors in religious education and discovered that nobody did anything specialized in the 16th century, which is a big deal for Bible translation. So I thought, hey, if they want to pay attention to me, which you have to get attention, you have to stand out to be able to get hired here. I'm like, I'll do something no one else is doing. When I went to England, I then just fell in love with the language and the people and the history. And then my hobby of studying reformers just kind of became more than a hobby. It's now really full-blown research interest. So it was fun.
So when you came to BYU, did you just apply, or were you working with did you come and teach here before you started to the application process?
Before I quit my job, when you teach in church seminaries and institutes, it's a hard job to get, especially as a woman. So it was a really risk that I was taking to leave it because I loved teaching the gospel and I didn't want to just quit that and not be able to do it. But I wanted to do it at the university level. So I was a little scared. So I actually came and talked to Camille Frank-Olson, who retired from here, and got some encouragement to make that leap because it was really scary.
And she made the same leap.
Yes, she did.
And so I'm glad you talked to her because she was a good role model for you.
She was, and she just encouraged me to not be afraid and to go for it, and that the Lord would look out for me. And so I left CES and went to England and had no idea that BYU would even be interested, just acted out of faith. And then when I was nearly done, I just reached out to Camille again, and because I had that contact, and then she's like, yeah, we have a job you can apply for. And so I went down that road and got hired after a couple of application times just because we had some family challenges. But it was a miracle, just a miracle.
Jan, tell us a little bit about your faith as a scholar and what helps you to live a life of discipleship along with living a life of scholarship.
That's a really, really good question. I love to research, and I'm not afraid to research. And I think sometimes people are afraid because they will find things that they're worried will undermine their testimony or something. But over the years, I've just developed an incredible confidence in God, that he's aware of all these issues, that he sees all of these things, and that he speaks to them. So for me to jump into the research and to look at what's going on out there is a adventure of understanding God, and that I don't need to be afraid of that. And that when I find things that seem to contradict truths that I know, I realize that there's more to be found. And I think for me, the best standpoint is that trusting God, that He is right, that He is true. And that's what I always approach all my research from, is a position of confidence that even if I find things that seem to contradict truth that I know, it just means I need to look a little deeper and look a little harder, and wait a little longer sometimes for revelation to come or for something to be discovered that nobody's discovered before. And then it will all fit back with the truth that I know. And so for me, it's just been taking a position of just confidence, that faith in, Alma 32 of, I don't have all the answers, but I know that God is good and that He doesn't do anything save it be for the welfare of His children. And He will help us find all that truth. And it sometimes is just a little adventure. It takes a little bit of time.
We live in a world where people can lose testimonies over a meme that comes across social media.
Yeah.
And I always think, seriously? You're going to accept something at such a surface level without digging more?
Yeah.
I appreciate your willingness to dig, Jan.
Yeah.
What gave you that confidence in God? What is it that led you to trust Him more than you trust a meme on the internet?
That again, that's a good question. Trusting God for me is something that's come over time. Many of people who know me know that I didn't get married for a long time. I got married in my 40s. And so it was actually through that process of not having that prayer answered for such a long time that I came to realize that confidence in God was a choice. And just because my prayers for certain things weren't being answered for a long time, just because I was single and left out of everything that most people were doing for a long time, that was really tough. But instead of letting that destroy me, I actually used it as a reason to get to know God and to understand His purposes. And it was in that process that I came to trust Him, that He knew what He was doing with me, that He had a plan, that He wasn't purposely keeping me away from the things that I wanted. He was just helping me walk a path that I needed to walk. And, the miracles I've seen and the things that have happened and the prayers that have been answered, I just came to know Him. And so taking that knowledge of Him from my personal life is really easy to apply it to my professional life and just say, yes, I don't fully understand why this is here, but He does, and He can make it known to me. And if I just have faith and do my work, research is hard work, and do it with meticulousness and keep looking and under every rock that's there and keep finding it, I will find it in the end. And I believe that. And so there's just no fear for me. I just trust Him. Even when I don't understand something, sometimes it's months and months and months of wrestling with something that you don't understand, that you finally come to realize later. But I love that process, and it's not threatening.
Thank you for listening to Why Religion. This podcast is a production of religious education at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. My name is Anthony Sweat. I'm the executive producer. The Why Religion podcast team also includes, from BYU Religious Education, Professors Brad Wilcox, Casey Griffiths, and Ryan Sharp. Recording and mixing were done by BYU students Mitchell Bashford and Connor Miller. Say hi, Mitchell and Connor.
Hey, guys.
Hi.
Original music and scoring for Why Religion podcast was created by the fabulous BYU student musicians Grant Cagle,
Sam Clausen,
Colette Jones,
and Alistair Scheuermann.
If you enjoy what you've heard, please like and subscribe to Why Religion on wherever you get your podcasts, and leave us a rating. It really helps. And join us next time as we continue to bring the everyday Latter-day Saint fascinating gospel studies done by Brigham Young University religion professors to enlighten your mind and strengthen your faith.